Now I can swap with them, and the first session can start. This is on, but you will sit here, and I can close this.
So I can invite Aleš and Father Václav. Come forward, please. In the meantime, I will share with you an English poem inspired by Matthew 5:44 to 45, because you ought to know some English literature too. So the poem goes, "The rain, it falls alike on the just and unjust fella, but more on the just, because the unjust has stolen his umbrella." Okay, so there you are. I was reminded of this when Ivana was giving her talk. I don't know if that's a mature thing or an immature thing, but it's fun. So we're going to have three contributions now, looking at the move from childhood to adulthood in three Abrahamic religions, so in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And we're going to start with Dr. Aleš Weiss, who is a Jewish theologian who studied, had doctorates. His Pavel Hoshek was explaining to me, very interesting on Buddhism and the understandings of Buddhism in Judaism, I think. But you can say more if you want. And he's involved, he teaches, and he's involved with the Prague Center for Jewish Studies. So thank you very, very much indeed for coming to be with us, Aleš, and over to you. And I will stop you after about 20 minutes if you're still going.
Okay.
Kindly, but firmly.
Do that. So, thank you, good afternoon. I would like to thank to Ivana Noble and the University Center of Excellence and all the co-organizers for the invitation. I will not talk about Buddhism today, but I understand my contribution as a sort of comparative background for predominantly Christian discussion, which will follow. So I will talk about bar mitzvah, the ritual of bar mitzvah, and about the age of 13 in Jewish tradition, because that was the topic I was supposed to talk about, was adolescence, growing, and that transition from childhood to adulthood. I will focus mainly on the Middle Ages sources, and therefore I apologize that many aspects of bar mitzvah ritual will be left. Among them, some crucial ones like gender issues, like creating parallel rituals for women later in, let's say, 19th and especially 20th and 21st century. But still, however, I believe that what I will talk about, I will talk about aspects which have some universal validity, like irrespective of gender. So let me say very briefly what bar mitzvah is. Bar mitzvah means literally the son of commandment, and refers to a boy who reaches the age of 13 years and 1 day. And from that moment on, such a person is fully obligated to keep Jewish law, halacha. The boy's public status is changed, and from now on he's counted into the quorum of 10 men, into the minyan, who are needed for the public prayer, and can legally marry, can read from the Torah scroll during the services, and some more other things. Today the term refers mostly to the celebration itself, let's say that the ritual as we have it today has 4 parts. When there's bar mitzvah, so the boy reads for the first time publicly from the Torah scroll during the synagogue service. After the boy's reading, his father publicly declares in a form of a blessing that he's not anymore responsible for his son's misconduct. So there's this, the boy is the one who is responsible, and there's a big celebration, which must be it's part of all the Jewish holidays and everything. There must be celebration and party, and then a drasha, a speech devoted to some aspects of the Torah. So for those who do not study Judaism in particular, it may be surprising that this ritual is not as old as is commonly assumed. In this form, it appears only from 16th century on, I would say very late, and only in Ashkenaz, only in Germany and France and this region. The Sephardic communities were introduced to the bar mitzvah ritual only in 19th and 20th century, very, 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 very late. So there are some components of it which are very old, like the reading of the Torah and the blessing of the Father, and there are many questions pertaining to the popularity of the ceremony, and which seems really to emerge as a custom of extremely pious fathers, not even the boys themselves, in France and later in Germany, and then spreads all over the Jewish world, as I said, in 20th century. There are, because it's mostly Christian conference, so what might be interesting is that some scholars stress the parallels with 12th and 13th century Christianity and the changing conceptions of childhood and religious majority, and especially in 13th century, where the issue was consent. Everything, a religious step, should be done with consent. So let's say, so for example, Ivan Marcus, a Jewish historian, points to the Christian ritual of oblation, devoting a child for the monastic life, and this was shifted to the age of 14 in 12th, 13th century. The same with bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is a very similar thing. It's like a taking on responsibility. Those who are interested in the history of bar mitzvah, great texts were written by Yisrael Tashma, Michael Hilton, David Golinkin, and Ivan Marcus, but I will not talk about that. I want to talk more about the age of 13 itself in the rabbinic literature. So there's a famous saying which goes like, the son of 13 years for the commandments, for the mitzvot. It's from Pirkei Avot, a very famous compilation of ethical statements. But this one is a late addition. It's not part of the text. It appears in the manuscripts only from 12th century on, and it fits well with all these things we said about religious majority and the change of the conception of childhood in 12th century. Because in the classical rabbinic texts, and one of them we have here, there is not a general conception of majority, right? So it's different. The 12th century, it really changes. In the Middle Ages, it really changes. The age of various obligations would vary according to the individual's ability to perform that particular commandment. So this, what you have here, is Tosefta Hagiga, let's say a 2nd century source, and it says a minor is liable to observe the commandment of dwelling in a sukkah, boot during the Festival of Tabernacles, and if he knows how to shake an object, lulav, he's liable to observe the commandment of lulav, shaking with palm trees. He knows how to do it, he's obliged to do it. There's nothing about the age of 13. If he knows how to clothe himself, he has to wear the fringes, tzitzit. If he knows how to speak, his father teaches him Shema, Torah, and the holy language. If he knows how to take care of his phylacteries, of tefillin, his father purchases phylacteries for him. When somebody is adult enough to perform a commandment, he or she is obliged to perform it. There is not a concept of being adult in general. Majority is a relative category, which is an interesting perspective. When one is adult enough for one thing, he doesn't have to be necessarily adult enough for another thing. Because there's also no biblically determined age for being obliged by the commandments. So how do we get to the age of 13? The age of 13 is indeed significant in rabbinic literature, but its scope is much more limited. There was a growing tendency to see a certain age as a signifier of physical and mental development. And I will bring two examples. I will probably make them a bit shorter. And these examples are connected to the issue of vows, nedarim, here, right? And the issue of pubic hairs, like the physical sign of maturity. Regarding a girl of 11 years and 1 day, her vows are examined, which means she's questioned in order to determine if her vows are valid. She vows something. At 12 years and 1 day, her vows stand, and we examine her vows for the entire 12th year. Regarding a boy of 12 years and 1 day, his vows are examined. At 13 years and 1 day, his vows stand. Probably skipping. So after this time, even if they say we do not know in whose name we vowed and in whose name we sanctified, their vows are vows and their sanctifications are sanctified property. Which means they are responsible for what they do from this age on. Another thing connected to maturity was pubic hair, the physical development of the body. A girl who has produced 2 pubic hairs is liable to observe all the commandments which are stated in the Torah. And so a boy who produces 2 pubic hairs is liable to observe all the commandments which are stated in the Torah. The age aspect becomes later much more dominant, and the age itself is considered to be a sign of maturity, without further need to examine the development of the body. So the standardization of the age of 13 and 1 day for a boy and 12 and 1 day for a girl is with the final validity confirmed only in the Middle Ages. And although this age becomes the age of transition from minority to majority, there are contexts in rabbinic literature where the importance of the biblical age of 20 is stressed, like judging capital punishments, selling inherited land. Like there is an idea that the age of 20 is something very important. So in rabbinic literature, the maturity really happens between the ages of 13 to the age of 20. So now I would like us to look at some midrashic material which comes from homilies, and which is connected to the age of 13. I will start with something which is expectable, but in my opinion, less common than what we will see later. And it starts with a hint to a famous biblical passage, which goes, "And the Lord God said, now that the man has become like one of us, knowing good and bad," like the issue of Adam's sin and responsibility. There's a long midrash, which I will not quote, but in the end of this midrash, God says, there's a discussion about evil impulse, evil inclination, and God says, "You people make him," this young person, "bad. For children of 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 years of age do not sin." I'm sorry, it's supposed to be here too. Okay, "do not sin. Only from the age 10 and older does he develop an evil inclination." So that is something which sounds, I would say, familiar to many of us. The image of childhood as the age of innocence, and the innocence which is corrupted by learning the habits of adults. But much more interesting, in my opinion, is much more frequent in the rabbinic literature, I would say, is an opposite notion. Well, now I will look weird, but according to this notion, children are ruled solely by the evil inclination until the age of 13. I have 4 small kids, and I can sometimes attest to that. So what happens at this age is, according to many sources, an appearance of a new human/divine quality. The authors of classical midrashim call it Yetzertov, like good inclination, a counterpart of Yetzer, Hara, of evil inclination. And this motif is repeated in many midrashim, mostly later midrashim, and I will quote from a midrash called Avot de Rabbi Natan, which you have also here. It has been said that the evil inclination is senior to the good inclination by 13 years, for it grows with and accompanies the child from the moment it comes forth from the mother's womb. When a man's passions are stirred and he's about to commit an act of lewdness, all his limbs are ready to obey him, because the evil inclination is king over the 248 limbs of man. On the other hand, when a man is about to perform an act of piety, all his limbs become sluggish, because the evil inclination which is within him bears sway over the 248 limbs of his body, whereas the good inclination is like one who is confined in prison, as it's stated, for out of prison he came forth to be king, from Ecclesiastes, which has been interpreted as referring to the good inclination. The good inclination is imprisoned and is liberated in the age of 13. Something very important happens at this age. So the age of 13 or 12 respectively is met much more with big expectations than with fear about the innocent soul of the child. So at this age, a young person becomes someone whose potential for understanding of getting to know God, man and universe and the world is at a critical point. Understanding is really critical for the liberation from the evil inclination. So the crossing the border of childhood means leaving the state of ignorance and becoming what a person is supposed to be. So in the language of Middle Ages philosophy, it's reflected differently, but there's a very similar issue. One gets to the point when his rational soul, the third and highest of all human souls, because Judaism in the Middle Ages mostly accepted the tripartite division of the soul, the Aristotelian division of the soul. So this rational soul is being actualized. And although the rational soul is in potentia in a human being from birth, sometimes it's identified with the divine image. So it must be acquired through cognition and contemplation. It must be developed somehow. So I will follow this theme in the Zoharic literature, in the mystical literature. And the following passage, which I will bring, and it's the last one, is from Zoharic corpus, which is a big corpus of mystical texts written like about in 13th century, something earlier, something later. And this is from Midrash Elam. Midrash Elam is in Zohar Chadash, in the new Zohar, but it has sometimes much older material than in the body of which is in the body of the Zohar itself. So it doesn't have this Sephirotic symbolism. It's mostly like philosophical allegories. And I will skip some parts, but it is right. It starts with Rabbi Elazar, the son of Shimon Bar Yochai, the main hero of this mystical epos. So Rabbi Elazar said, until 13 years, a person's striving is with that creaturely soul, the animal soul in the Aristotelian language. From 13 years and upward, if he wishes to be righteous, the holy supernal souls hewn from the king's throne of glory is bequeathed him. Rabbi Shimon, son of Yochai, invited the masters of Mishnah to eat at a great feast he prepared for them, and he decorated his entire house with precious adornments. He seated the rabbis on one side and himself on the other, and he was exceedingly joyous. They said to him, "Why is the joy of our master greater today than other days?" He replied, "Today the holy supernal soul is descending via the four wings of the creatures upon Rabbi Elazar, my son. At this celebration I will attain consummate joy." He seated Rabbi Elazar, his son, next to himself. He said, "Be seated, my son, be seated, for on this day you are holy, among the share of the holy ones." Rabbi Shimon said a certain word, and fire surrounded the house. The rabbis went out and saw smoke ascending from the house the entire day. Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Shimon, son of Lekonia, arrived. He found the rabbis astonished, standing in the street. He said to them, "What's going on?" They replied, "Look at this smoke from the celestial fire. It's because today Rabbi Elazar is being crowned with a holy crown." The rabbis saw four wings of an eagle descending in fire. surrounding him, and Rabbi Shimon, his father. Rabbi Yosef sat there until the fire abated. It's a beautiful text which goes on, and this text develops in a highly poetic language and mythical language the aforementioned philosophical idea. Man was designed to reach the fullness of his or her potential, and the holy soul, Nishmeta Kadisha in Zohar, enters into man at the age of 13, and ideally this holy soul takes leadership and develops until the age of 20. Zohar has to cope with the significance of the age of 22, of both ages, because they are somehow halachically relevant. And later on develops the idea that one becomes the son of Shechina, the female aspect of God, in the age of 13, while at the age of 20 becomes the son of Tiferet, of the male aspect of God. Both of them are important. I assume I'm getting close to 20 minutes, but I would just want to say that the theological aspects of Bar Mitzvah point, in my opinion, to a very positive understanding of adolescence, right? Instead of approaching the age primarily with fear and viewing it as a potential threat to the innocent soul of a child, like corruption of childhood, the dominating perspective, as reflected in the Jewish sources, is really there is something to celebrate. The person is leaving a period characterized by ignorance, as kind of ignorance, by ethical vulnerability, inclination to maybe not evil, but let's say unholy, among others. And all these traits are in many sources considered to belong among the characteristics of childhood. The Corinthians are now just reminds me really of the text of the Corinthians. So adolescence is the age when, according to some midrashim, the child receives good impulse, this Yetzertov, or realizes his or her rational soul, or receives this Nishmeta Kadisha, this holy soul, this third soul. So therefore, it's a very joyous event. It's a culmination of a long process, and the child becomes a human in the full sense of the word. This idea is not self-evident, right? We could be tempted to think about that period as an age where Yetzer Hara, this evil inclination, often connected with sexuality, when the issue of sexuality rises with all its real and imagined dangers. So it's not so. It's surprisingly this age, also age of sexual development, is considered to be the age of activation of forces in a human soul or human mind, which are extremely supportive for a moral development. So the culture of Torah study, the focus on intellectual ability and to obligation to God, the social and religious responsibility, celebrate leaving childhood. And now I really don't want it to hear that Judaism doesn't have anything good to say about childhood. It's not so. Aleš Baumgarten has a lot of beautiful texts about childhood and Jewish traditions, so I recommend to all those who are suspicious now to read them. But still, a person is not born to be a child. I think that's very clear from rabbinic sources. It's a wonderful and important period, but it's good to leave it one day. So what is the majority of the age of 13? It's mainly, as I said, religious, moral, social, like ethical majority. It's something which cannot be done with a certain level of understanding. One is suddenly able to think about the consequences of its choices, moral choices, religious choices. And this type of majority, and that's important move in the Middle Ages, became the leading criterion for majority in general. So it's not being able to fight, like let's say in the Torah, the age of 20. Adult is somebody who is able to fight, right? It's the age of 13 when somebody is able to make ethical decisions, moral decisions, like starts to feel his sense of belonging and take some moral responsibility for the community. I understand. It's
Thank you very much. Please, we'll now have 10 minutes for questions. So I think if we do it one at a time, maybe the simplest. So, I will pass the microphone to Pavel.
Thank you for the microphone. Thank you very much for this illuminating lecture. Just for clarification, I think translating Yetzer Hara with the word evil inclination might suggest that we are talking about moral evil in the strong sense, which I would not think is actually meant. So could you just one or two sentences on how Yetzer Hara is to be understood in relation to this childhood period of human life?
It's a great question, because mostly when you see Yetzer Hara, so it's connected with the issue of sexuality, which is obviously not at this age, but it's not always. Not always in the rabbinic literature, Yetzer Hara means sexuality. I would really translate it as something like being driven by chaotic forces in a way, right? Not being able to make moral choices, not being in control over situations, and that's Emil Fackenheim has a beautiful chapter about Yetzer Hara, where he basically, I would say, stresses the issue of sexuality and idolatry, but both of them are some loss of control when they are problematic, right? Which idolatry is considered to be always problematic, sexuality definitely not. But I would say, like, being ruled by something else, not being able to make rational choices. That's.
Other questions, comments? Pavel.
Thank you very much also, Aleš, for a wonderful lecture. You were talking in your presentation, you were talking mostly about individual growing up, whereas in your title of your paper as
Right.
it is, it suggests that there might be a communal aspect of that. It says when Israel was a child. So I'm wondering if you could perhaps say a couple of words on this communal aspect.
Okay, the title. I wasn't sure about the title, but then I decided for a certain content, and I left the title unchanged. But still, the title has a connection. It's a famous the verse from the prophet Hosea, and that verse is about this metaphor of childhood, like of Israel as a child, and God as a father, as a really loving father, and in the rabbinic reading, this verse is about the issue of responsibility. It's like God doesn't hold children responsible. Israel wasn't held responsible and was doing terrible abominations in Egypt, and still God's love was so great that God took us from Egypt and did all these things. So that's the verse of Hosea, and the connection. I think the communal aspect. I'm not sure if I understand the question about the communal aspect of maturing or of aging.
Yeah, if there would be something that perhaps not so much focus on individual, but on community, if there is something.
So, like, definitely, like, majority has a legal and social consequences, and that's I think very apparent in the bar mitzvah ritual, right? Like, somebody is introduced into the community and is someone who is really a member of the community in the full sense of the word. So, as I said, like, religious functions, but still it's limited. There are still some say hesitations about what happens between the age of 13 and 20, and so some roles, let's say, I don't know, giving priestly blessing, some rabbis said that could be done only when someone is 20. The whole temple service, it's only for those who were 20, was only for those who were 20. In some religious sources, leading prayer was for those who were 20. But all these things were communal. Like so, we talk about individual, but the individual lives in a community.
Thank you. Any further questions? Maria.
Thank you. Thank you for your lecture. There is a passage in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus is in the temple, and I thought he was doing his bar mitzvah, but now I understand that isn't possible.
Right? No. So
that's historical. Is possible.
Historically, it's impossible. At first, as I said, this ritual developed pretty late, and before 13th century, it was customary for boys to read even before the age of 13. So they would publicly read the Torah, and especially Haftarah, which is what Jesus reads. Like if we, so before the age of 13, it was quite common when, as we had in this Mishnah. So when somebody was able to read, I can hear. All right. When somebody was able to perform a certain thing, so he did it. So when a child was able to read the Torah, so he read the Torah, even if he was 9 years old, 10 years old, it really didn't matter. So it's only with the 12th, 13th century change in the conception of childhood where this activity really became reserved for those who are after 13 years and 1 day. And even in the 13th century, when we have testimonies about the public Torah reading, we know that there was a public Torah reading of those who were 13 years and 1 day, but it never says that it was their first public reading of the Torah. It comes even a bit later.
Okay. Thank you very, very much indeed, Aleš, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
So now I'm very happy to invite Father Václav Ježek. It's great to have you back with us again at our conference.